Hi. This is session 1 of the second day of the Bootstrap seminar, and we're going to launch this with Margaret Chambers is going to put you to work a little bit.
Good morning. We have a couple of new people who have joined us today, and we want to start by first letting them introduce themselves. Joel, would you stand? Yes. And use the mic and just introduce yourself and tell us why you're here and your relationship, your interest here.
People.
Good morning. I'm Joel Orr. I am an Engelbart groupie. I've been following Doug from afar for many years, and a few months ago I had a call from him because he had been in contact with the founder of Autodesk, a company with which I'm somewhat affiliated. I'm an Autodesk fellow, among other things, and my principal areas of interest are manufacturing and engineering and the automation thereof. And I am trying to get an Engelbart pilot project going within Autodesk, but it's going to take a while to do that. Glad to be here.
And I believe you're new today too, Harry. Did you find the mic? All right, thank you.
Hi, Harry Kelly from Apple Computer. Primary interest is to learn our primary interest at work is information access technologies, mainly how we give our information to our customers, allow them to access it on their own network. And primary interest here is just to watch Mr. Engelbart at work and hear some of the interactions. So learn it.
Thank you. Yesterday we shared a little bit of what had brought us here, and someone remarked that in the sharing we got, some people gained some clarity and focus. This morning we're going to do something else to also further our focus and clarity, something that we should do if we're wanting to continue to learn, and that is a little reflecting. We talked yesterday about what was the challenge, the problem, or the question that brought you here. And I would like to have you take 5 minutes before we begin this morning to turn to the back of section D in your notebook. You'll notice that there are a couple of blank pages there at the end of the page. There's some room to write. I would like to have you just take some time and write down your reflections of how the discussions and presentations of yesterday have changed or challenged the ideas that you came with, or the questions or challenges that you came with yesterday. Is there any question? If not, I will leave you for 5 minutes of reflection.
I think that, Eric, turn the mic down a little bit. Good morning. I would like to come and peek at what you wrote. You wrote something. There's some kind of a right line I'd like to be able to travel through these 3 days. That on the one hand, I've been working in this area so long and thinking about it and putting together the concepts and building on them. And so, to me, there's a whole pile of riches in each of those 6 domains to talk about. And I keep feeling like it's important to get relatively firm those sets of concepts in your mind. And but there's only so much you can get in 3 days before you get overloaded. And so it's sort of that fine line. And I had a feeling yesterday afternoon I was doing a little bit more overload, et cetera, like that. And I don't quite know what to do about it. So we'll try more of these sort of dialogue sessions if we can. But getting to some of the explicit demonstration things of actually what we built and describing what we did can kind of help make that happen. But it's a sort of toss-up. We used to do that stuff first and then talk about the concepts, and you realize that a lot of the explicits went by without being able to connect them to concepts. So then when you do it the other way around, people have a hard time keeping up with this concept after concept. And so anyway, I don't know what the answer is, except we should do this on a 30-day seminar instead of 3. But what it really comes down to is if this kind of strategy is going to work, something like the C community's got to be a place where you can have really a continuing developmental dialogue going on that takes all these concepts and keeps developing them and merging them with what else is going on in people's mind till there's some commonly held perception and picture about the whole sets of things we're talking about. So let's just go through a quick review of Section A again, just to show you the pieces. And those would be the highlight things that in the C community we'd really pursue and develop all of them. And today, so anyway, we start out in B1 oriented to sort of, here are the objective of the objective of what we're really trying to pursue is high performance organizations. And there's 6 kind of hypothesized strategic elements that comprise the whole. And we did a lot of emphasis on paradigms at the outset. Spent a lot of time on paradigms, and that the shift in paradigm is on one hand the biggest impediment, the biggest challenge in getting to the future is shifting paradigms. And also paradigms represent the kind of approach that if you're going to be able to get to the future in some effective way, we have to learn how to cultivate paradigm shifts. So we have to learn how to create new paradigms. And we actually got to the point of saying not only that, but one of the kind of reoriented about paradigms is people need to get oriented in their paradigm that paradigms are going to shift. So they have to develop a paradigm shifting paradigm. And that's sort of another way of expressing that kind of bootstrapping thing, that if we're going to get to the future effectively, we have to start being strategic. So as we learn more and more about how to get people to start moving in their paradigms, we have to start helping them move in particular towards a paradigm about paradigm shifting. And so anyway, and we also point out, I think this is borne out by anybody who expressed his own experiences, that paradigms get shifted much, much more effectively by people, the experiences people go through. So you don't get it. You can sort of get your fancies tickled or something by talking and lecturing or something like that, and maybe some examples point out to get experiences of your own to relate, etc. might do it, but it's when you can design and plan for pilot things, pilot operations that'll go on that will actually provide experiences for people that will help that shift. So that's an important part of the strategy when we talk about C communities and what they're going to do to help bees make pilots better. One of the important considerations in the bee designing and implementing pilot operations is what kind of experience. You have different choices of what kind of new operations you're going to establish with what kinds of people and how you're going to deploy those first kinds of people in the world. So it's important to say, oh, one of the things about whom I choose, who I choose, and where I deploy them is going to be the experience that provides not only to that group but to the other people around them who may have a lot of leverage and we have a lot of dependence on them. So this leads sometimes to say, oh, we'll start with the executives. And I back off immediately and say, no, don't start with the executives. We'll explain that later. But you can start with pilot operations that some of the key executives will have a chance to be exposed to what's going on inside of there enough so that experience will start moving them better. So anyway, that for paradigms, and we said, well, all right. Oh, what am I doing? I'm in the wrong section. So then in the overview, in A2, we were starting down this list of hypotheses kind of thing. And the first one is, look, there is a whole system that you can look at that actually builds on top of basic human capabilities to give you a net result of an infrastructure of capabilities in your organizations that leads to whatever you want. It's only built by an infrastructure, and it's the augmentation system that builds it. And we talked a lot about the impact upon that whole system of the extreme scale of improvements in the technology side of it, and the whole system would like to get changed. And what came out of it is the paradigm sort of aspect of that is to expect a lot of change in that human system, and that our old paradigms didn't really think about, have in them the notion of very many candidates in that human system that were there for change. But you think there could be radical changes in roles, in the skills and the methodologies employed, in the conventions that are adopted, the forms that are used, organizational structures, fluidity. It's a tremendous amount of potential change in all of that that's likely to start happening. And we went on to say, in the ABC model, A3, that somehow, if you're going to subject an organization or think of being serious long-term changes, you have to get the B and the C categories clarified, and that B is generally pretty cloudy and messy, and they're generally hard to find anything that's really an active C with a whole scope for the organization, but that getting those clarified is going to be very important. And then further, there are things to look at in more of this bootstrapping leverage, that if early capabilities you go after are such that they'd be very valuable when they're applied in A and in B and in C, then if you deploy early in them, because you have a limited amount of capacity in early established significant capabilities, deploy them first in C. That gives you a lot of potential advantage. And then that can be migrated on up to B, because the particular capabilities we talked about as Kodiak just have built into them a beautiful way to start developing and transferring knowledge. So it starts moving up the line. So the A4 diagram sort of gives, in one way, the picture of saying, okay, if you go after that kind of capability, you start improving the first and second derivative, both of your improvement process. And then we're starting in to spend time on how you define the kind of capabilities that make that first bootstrapping target to go after. And we gave it the name Kodiak, and sort of isolated too that not only hadn't there been a name before for what an augmentation system is, there also isn't any sort of name for the Kodiak. And so that's not so surprising. But also inside of Kodiak is what is the knowledge product of a group of people working. There's no sort of definitive term for that, and we had been using the term handbook for many years. And with the model in one's mind that the future of those knowledge products are going to be multimedia, hypermedia, encapsulated documents that can be read, moved around, and handled very flexibly. And then you look in the environment that's in A5 is showing that, that in the sense of the Kodiak, where concurrently developing, integrating, and applying knowledge, that the that if all of these things, collecting external information, integrating it into your knowledge base, that this is in a compatible hyperdocument base also, and so is all of the recorded dialogue that goes on about integrating and talking about this, about what you're going to do next here, and including the old versions of these things. That's all the record of what went on. So altogether, this part of it would be evolving a natural corporate memory, and this fades into it as soon as it's superseded, and this is the natural product. So this sort of gives you a picture in a intensive knowledge development domain of what we're talking about as supporting Kodiak. And we talked about all these things going on concurrently, and that not only this group is doing it concurrently, but it is concurrently working that way with other groups. So things that it's bringing in from the external world, et cetera, are things in other groups. So there's this dynamic, nested set of large organizations, and we were just getting in yesterday to realize within a huge aerospace program how many organizations and people could reasonably be, say, you'd get advantage if they all were in some interoperable basis. So in A6 we go and look and kind of say, all right, that's the sort of basic description of the kind of interoperability you'd need. And so we start talking about, in the end, someday some set of open standards are going to be needed so that you can have that interoperability. And we hope that we can explore how you can get value from this kind of hyperdocument Kodiak support environment so that we kind of know where we can fight to get these standards established so that you can get the interoperability. As if certain degrees of interoperability keep giving a lot more value, but you get diminishing returns after a while, you say, all right, we'll stop fighting by the time we get there. But when there's still lots of gain, lots of real economic human potential resource gain by that slope, it's worth going after. So we were just beginning to discuss that. And then in A7 is what we're going to go on today beyond, is to start talking about the sort of principles of design that seem to be relevant for aiming for a hyperdocument system that will support it, and sort of arriving at some of the basic requirements we think that an open system would have. And we want to go on further and tomorrow with talking about when the C activities join forces to be a C community as sort of an important example. Why did you think I needed that? Thank you, Mary. My apologies to you guys. So anyway, this gives you sort of a review. And what we'll do is go just remind ourselves about section E, where we stopped yesterday. And we had just been talking about at E13 about the degree of standards that someone's likely to reach, and people are starting to say, well, you know, it's impractical to go after a complete standard. We had the discussion of saying, well, that's true, but if you kind of don't have an eye for where the real value is, it's hard to call yourself a strategic planner. So anyway, so however near you can get it. And I don't want to spend too much time. There's more things in the binder than we can cover. Very sorry you're not going to stay for the other 27 days. But there's some of the thinking, like in E35, where we had the picture of how all the different fragmented improvement projects that may be going on within an organization look sort of scattered, and you realize that if there were an active C process within that organization, that we moved to E37, and we'd see that, if there really was an effective Kodiak process being employed by C that the B people can tune in on, so they don't have to necessarily have enough of that capacity to turn and employ it in their A work or between themselves, but if the C activity, with those guys being able to tune in on this hyperdocument knowledge base developing, you'd already have a very important kickoff start for integrating and supporting them very importantly in what they're going to be doing. So I think what we'll do is just sort of say that wraps up E, and we'll move right on to the next section, which in my alphabet today is G. Sorry about that. I'm going to do G first before F. It's really great to have the kind of power you can say I'm changing the alphabet. Hyperpower, yeah. Hyper alphabet. Anyway, what I realized that it's one of those toss-ups again, but there are things when I'm going to start talking about the hyperdocument system. I think it's important for some of the characteristics in the demonstration and the things you want to show there to have a feeling for the architectural principles. And I don't suppose very many of you here are deep architecture people, and I can point out that back in section P is a paper that sort of gives a fairly good descriptive overview of why we did the architecture the way we did and describes it in detail, pretty much detail. And so what I'd like to do here is then stay in G and sort of move fairly rapidly, sort of starting with G1 and G2, just to give you a feeling for that there's a paper that's also in the back that's in section O that was called the Augmented Knowledge Workshop. And that term, the Augmented Knowledge Workshop, is something I began using about 1970 to say if you're setting up in this network environment and people are all working at displays that are in that environment, what you want to think of them as doing is they're reaching through that into the organizational knowledge workshop. And we're talking about an augmented workshop that's much enhanced. And so this is a term we were using to say that's what you want to be able to architect. As a workshop, you got brand new tools and materials to work with. So, workshop procedures and processes and skills as well as tools are all things that you merge together and work on. So it gave a good sort of metaphor for how to talk about it. So that paper in section O, setting the stage for the workshop and a lot of the conditions in it, and then the paper in P goes into the specific higher level architecture that we evolved. And so what we see in section G here are just some outline characteristics of that, but G1 and G2 give some of sort of the outlines, and G3. So in that paper we talked about, one was what are the basic assumptions about Augmented Knowledge Workshop. So we say yes. So mind you, this was published in '73, and it didn't seem to make much of a splash. But it really is bearing out. So we said, all right, we assume that your organizational knowledge workshop is going to be embedded in a computer network. Because remember, we've been oriented about being on the ARPANET since '67, and the ARPANET had started in '70, and the principles of the Ethernet were already at work in 1968 out in Hawaii, if you didn't know that. University of Hawaii had set up and gotten one radio channel that they got the chance to be using between the islands. So they worked up this system that's just exactly the Ethernet principle, where everybody that's going to send on it just sends at random, and if they don't get an acknowledgement by the packet they sent, they retransmit at random time. So you have a certain number of overlaps and such, but the things get through. It's exactly the principle that Ethernet adopted and such like that. So you could see how all this was going to come pretty well. And so he says, all right, and that they're going to be a coordinated set of user interface principles in order for an organization to sort of evolve its organizational sense. You can't have every person sort of having his arbitrary sort of set of interface standards, etc. And that you'll have grades of user proficiency that you really should accommodate. Very important. You know, it's like some people, all they need is a pair of gas pliers and a crescent wrench and a big quarter-inch screwdriver, and that's about all they need to fix what they need to fix. But then you look at a real professional who's got many, many more tools, and it takes a long time to learn which one goes where and even their names. But you shouldn't have a totally different vocabulary for each different scale of skill levels, toolkit, something like that. And then talking about workshop domains or knowledge domains in there, that you have to have easy communication between them, and you have to provide some kind of standardization so you don't have islands. And you have to have a provision so users, whatever sort of functional things they employ, they have to be able to compound these into macros. So he said that's a key thing that's necessary. And it goes on to say, and it's also very important that you have to have what we call people support. At this time, we were already designing to go out and support people on the network. So we had started to hire, what I finally decided was the very best thing to hire to go out and help people, train them to use this, was the most non-threatening kinds of person I could find. So we recruited liberal arts, female college grads, all eager to try something new and such like that. So it was really a good choice, because they went out and were very clever about some of the things they learned and did, and they got all into it, and they weren't programmers, and they didn't threaten, and we really got them to learn how not to take any crap from programmers too. He says, you watch what my job is to do this, see, and they do. And incidentally, you talk about some of the inertia problems that you run across when you go out there, and these women were just great. So one of them came back. She'd been 2 weeks at a place where they were brought in the whole thing and got it set up. You remember yesterday I told you that the initial setup of a new group caused all sorts of problems which don't appear later once it gets underway. Well, a particular problem that appeared in this one was, well, you have to, the boss was starting to say he didn't like these workstations around, so he says, move them down the hall into the closet where they belong. See? So that was the kind of attitude that he had. And she was a very smart gal. So this was all starting happening, upsetting the people who were trying to work it. So she just found him alone one time and said, well, you know, I know you're very busy and don't really have time to learn all this, so, you know, I'm staying in a motel over here, and it doesn't matter what time I get. I could get in at 7:30 because I hear you come in early before anybody else does, and I can sort of start showing you before you get really busy. And what she really meant, before the other people are around to watch you be dumb. See? Oh, well, all right. And within a week, the terminals were back, and he was excited, and they were moving on. See? So where do you find that kind of lore? See? You build it from experience. So how do you propagate that kind of lore and merge it with many of the other things that can go on? And so anyway, that's the kind of thing that needs to be in the handbook for B people. It's just a lot of things like that. Like that. So anyway, we were assuming also you're going to find a range of workstations and symbol representations. That means sort of the capacity of the workstation. In those days, can it do graphics? Nowadays, has it got 3D dynamic color or something? But anyway, you find a whole range of those that you need to support, and that the methodologies by which people apply these tools is a very important part of the whole thing you're trying to do in the workshop building like that, and that you're likely to lead to changed roles and organizational structures. So these are all the framework in which we said within that framework you need to develop a suitable architecture. So we went through that, and the next 6 or 7, next 5 diagrams are sort of the evolution in the late 60s and early 70s. So this is kind of fun. G4, we're going to build an application program on top of in a computer on top of an operating system. And so you go hire programmers to build it. And pretty soon what you realize is the programmers are telling you that since they know what's going on inside the computer, they're the proper ones to tell you how to design the interface. And you start saying, now wait a minute, that's not your job. I'm doing the programming, my God, you know, if I were a carpenter in this building, you know, I know how to build a building. I says, yes, but you have an architect. So I finally says, you've got to have two different kinds of hats, an architect and a builder. So we moved to G5 and said, we're going to divide the job into two parts. And when you come talking to me, I want to be really clear which hat you think you're wearing. If you're wearing the programmer's hat, okay, but don't start talking about number one when you're wearing that hat. And that cleared things for a while, but it still was. We actually were developing a special language by 1968 to program the interface. So then, later than that, we decided, well, let's just make it a separate module, as in G6. So we designed a separate module, and it wasn't long before we realized that, look, we're talking about a whole knowledge workshop. So we moved to G7, that there are going to be lots of application tools out there, and why have different user interface modules for them all? So we started by the late 60s to designing how you'd handle that with a general thing that we called the user interface system in there. And that evolved till we had our third or fourth very solid implementation of that by 1976, when we sort of got bumped in the commercial world.
So if you just go back and go over G7 a little bit more detail, say what that's trying to show.
Yeah. In G7, we've got numbers 1, 2, and 3 are different application programs, all of which can support users. And we're saying, look, let's build one common user interface module, the front end, that's going to support the user in gaining access and harnessing any of those things. So let's look for one universal kind of front-end design that can do that, to give homogeneity and all of that. Does that answer your question?
Okay. The lines were...
Yes. I have to scold my graphic person for having a line go through that FE module.
Yeah, that isn't really a connected line.
No. Thanks. I got to go easy on her because she was working till 2 o'clock last night to get the new bundle in. See.
Complain, I just don't understand.
Yeah. No, I'm going to complain. But anyway, so then we moved to G8 and saying that this was what the assumption we had that it was going to be inside organizations, because by that time Timeshare was already building a TimeNet, and the ARPANET out there is both large public ones, and the Ethernet was being puttered around. We were just sure that there was going to be a configuration like this, so this was the design idea. So we say you got workstations, and by workstation we just meant later the term, we used that for whatever station you were sitting at and working. And later than that, then that began, the connotation was that you've got a powerful computer in there. Instead of, we were saying, look, whatever you've got, whether you've got computer support right there or not, that's your workstation. And then later we said, let's separate that from the terminal equipment you have from whatever processing and memory you have locally. So that we would shift then to the next one in G9, or no, G9, 10, and 11, let's just say this is starting to interpret that in client-server models. And those weren't terms that were being used in those days, but if they were, we would migrate down through to G11 to say that our user interface thing actually, we would think that one of the modules actually supported the human as a client. So we said that user interface module is a server to serve the client, human, but underneath it were a bunch of clients out there dealing with the different application servers. So that's That's our model, and I'm very sorry that X Windows came along and changed they used a different terminology, but what, Mark?
Okay, so what you're saying, this last model here is really a peer-to-peer network, right?
Yeah. You want to explain to people? Yeah. You explain that to people, so I'm sure
Okay, what I mean by that is that it looks like client-server is a real familiar term to people because but what that evolved to when you take the human as a client is that all the servers are really it's a peer network, so that every server, every workstation is a server. So there's no distinction anymore between workstations that are clients and servers. They're all servers. And so it becomes a peer-to-peer network, which is one of the evolving hardware terms that's coming into play.
If I can add a word to that, I think what's happened is that the hierarchical nature of the network has become separated from the topology of it, so that the hierarchy is then temporal. It's at a given moment there may be a hierarchy, and one server may be at the top of the hierarchy, and in another application it might be changed. So it's just another level of buffering that has occurred in the terminology as well as in the system.
That's great. So as we moved then to G12, and through the years when I talk about that, I'd say, okay, here I want to talk about topology and not geometry, see? And that I don't care where those software modules are. This is the topological relationship we're going to have in working with them. And so that if some of them migrate from a big mainframe time-shared server out to a local thing or back and forth, that doesn't matter. So what you're designing for is a flexible topology that can do that kind of migrating without having to redesign and redo applications and communication protocols. So you notice that in G12 that we say terminal up here, and that's exactly what we mean there. That's your keyboard, your mouse, and your key set, of course, and your loudspeakers or whatever else in the display that are your terminal equipment, what you're interacting with. And it's that equipment and whatever drivers they need that are represented there. And then the user interface system is the module then that interfaces between that. And the terminal equipment is sort of, terminal hardware is sort of what you say represents the user in a sense. The user's actuating that or visualizing, perceiving on there. So that server, the user interface system, we call the front end, is built. And then the different applications be out there on some virtual bus, which would be at whatever layers they go on. And then we further distinguish to say, look, there's going to be something there that each user sort of visualizes topologically as, that's my workshop, my workplace. And it's going to be where you keep your notes and send and receive your mail, and just, it's like your desk. And other things out there are sort of utilities you can reach through to. So we had this concept of reaching through to those things, but that it made a new sense that if you're going to interact with the database, you didn't sort of get switched to that and then have to do the probing stuff straight. Your workplace is something where it's very flexible for you to organize things, like query statements. You organize them here. And then that gets launched out to the database. When it comes back into here where you can organize it and do what you want, put notes on it, or shape the new query that goes out. So it's sort of that sense that you stayed in your workplace in a familiar, powerful environment that was built to support all that kind of conjoint work with other things as well as what you do inside. So the system we built then was designed to be that local workplace in this model, and in the sense of also functionally to go after the kind of Kodiak support. And that so we moved to G13 and look at what we actually, in the stages of implementing that. So these are this user interface module is going to have more in it than this. But the very first thing is to say, well, we need to communicate through the network, So we built procedure call protocols with procedure call interfaces in between. And as far as I know, we had the first real working full-featured procedure call protocol. I can't find anything that preceded that. And then that migrated over to Xerox, and their courier system or something was actually an offshoot. The guy that built this went over there and built courier and things like that. So historically, if anybody knows earlier ones, let me know. But it was being built for just the purpose in mind here. So we did more than that too. We said in here, if we want to be able to handle different terminal equipment, because that was one of the specifications we laid down for it, we need a virtual terminal controller here that can look at the terminal characteristics for that given terminal and then map the virtual input that comes through here to do the best it can in that display. That sort of display system. So we actually had that with 3 different levels of virtual terminal, you know, typewriter level. In fact, in Augmented, you can still say you're a typewriter and you can move around and do things as you're a typewriter. And so anyway, so then that plan is that all the different servers then can work as though to some virtual workstation. So this was the plan, and that remote procedure call protocol, I'll sort of skip what it does. But one of the things in G16 is that when your primary modules are interconnected this way, it's very easy then to intersperse or intercede in the middle of any of that path with some other module, which therefore you say, oh, that's where I can have my workshop that I can start developing, sort of be hand-driven and flown around in that space. But it's very easy to install smart agents in there that can start being smarter about what they can do to support the people. So this we never quite got into the expensive support that we could actually do that. Ted?
Doug, I'm feeling a little lost. Can you look at current existing systems that are kind of tied this way and make a contrast between the way this was designed about 15 to 20 years ago versus the way we're actually using things like internet or something now, so I can see where the disparity is?
Well, let some guys are more expert about today. Tell him.
I need some grounding on a concrete example because I'm feeling lost in the diagram.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, the trend seems very much that there are remote procedure call protocols that are there at a very important level as a standard way of communicating between modules through networks. And things like the Windows systems starting providing some sort of standards as you drive into them. And you know, that virtual terminal kind of sort of thing.
I guess what I'm trying to see is how much of this, how much of this, as it was actually conceived and designed about 20 years ago, how many of these kinds of pieces have actually made their ways into such things as the internet and standard communications, the sorts of displays that we see on that?
Yeah, I really don't know what the evolutionary path was out there. There was, you know, so I can't answer that in detail. You have any? You want?
Just to address your original question, Ted, what Doug is describing is the process by which the different aspects of the user interface and the application program and the data became buffered from one another. And the procedure calls that he's describing and the terminal description files and so on were devised to further buffer things so that if you have a dumb terminal, the system would know and would perform in software those functions that you couldn't perform in hardware. If you had a smarter terminal or one with graphical capabilities, the system would know that. And terminal emulators is the coarsest form of, and no, that's where it came from. But today, that all happens pretty much invisible to the user, and that's the evolution of it, is that today, you sit down at a box, and internet doesn't do this, but there are other networking. For example, within X window, there is the capability for the system to know how much power you have locally in order to do those things that were before done on the central computer.
Yeah, or to use another example, I guess with Apple Link, you ended up having a particular kind of front-end interface to something that actually has nothing to do with what you see in your interaction in terms of the way it's structured, nor does it care.
Yeah, although...
When you say buffering, the idea is that you don't have to have these things so tied to links that all of a sudden if you make one change here, then you've got to be making changes every single other place that you want.
Right.
Yeah, there were something like 13 or 14 of the people that were building this moved to Xerox and then out to allow the rest of the world, and I'd like to find out sometime what the evolution of the design things were out in there. But what I just wanted to come to point out several that I think are the most significant that didn't get there, that I feel they still will. But something about this whole framework is important, and so the G17 is introducing one more module in that user interface, one more element in that is important, and that was what we called a command language interpreter, and so that every event that the user executes gets passed to that command language interpreter, and it looks up in a grammar file to say, oh, you know, that there's sort of a description of the interactive language that you got for that user in a special form in that grammar file, and it says, oh, it's hit this character or it's clicked on a mouse, so I know what to do. I look in the grammar to see what to do and go back, and what to put on his display, or at some point what to transmit to the procedure call interface out to the server for some results. And then for different users, you could have different profiles of behavior there as described for each user by a user profile file that would be also attached by that user. So when you come up to working on this, the particular terminal you use gets this terminal description file tied to a virtual terminal controller, and your user profile gets tied on there, and you're off. So the idea was saying, they didn't use the term then, but you could actually have a command language interpreter that had a look and feel to present to the user whatever the choice wanted to be, but it would use the same vocabulary in the grammar. So saying that then you could do two things. One is that you have a universal grammar and control of it in this way, but that can evolve in some sensible way, and also that any given user could use whatever subset of that vocabulary wanted to. So the simple beginning user wouldn't be bothered with big vocabulary and could have a look and feel that they wanted to. So I feel like that's a very important architectural feature that got lost. A lot of it, I think, is everyone decided what we've got the look and feel we want to do, but that as we talked about yesterday, I'm really sure that the way organizations are going to be able to get up and really move is that they have to have the possibility for classes of users to get to have very large vocabulary, that get very eloquent in and very flexible in moving and doing, and that can't be a different vocabulary, and have a different look and feel, but a bigger vocabulary. So that's the one thing that didn't get there. And we could make, it's like in G18, well, let's see, back to G17. I'm really giving Eric the workout here, who has to move the camera. Pierluigi?
Excuse me, Doug. I'm curious if it seems that the CLI is an ideal complement for the key set, and I was interested in the development of the CLI.
No, the key set was a decade earlier. That's sort of part of your terminal drivers, not as farther towards the user. But it's part of the same thing of saying, look, you want to provide it if somebody can accelerate himself like this and would rather have his nouns and verbs that he executes, he specifies before he clicks on it like we do here. Okay, that's a different look and feel, but you should employ the same vocabulary. And so anyway, you notice in the back end then the way we designed the augment system actually was that you could actually make modules that would provide you different subsystems that worked on top of all the basic augment stuff. And so that you could have a simple command that said that we ended up for some reason go to a different tool set. So you go to it, boom. So all it changes is the top command line says, oh, I'm a different language now. So it changed the grammar file and the subsystem file, just boom, change it like that. And you find out you've got a different set of verbs or nouns and or mix to a different subsystem. So nothing changed on your screen. So it was very, very interesting way, and I don't find that today either. So here in G18 are just a typical set of the subsystems that we built and employed. And executive system is really working on the exec level, but base is the one that I'll be demonstrating the most. But there is a mail system you can flip to that has lots of special provisions, but all the items are still just part of the same file structure, the same sense of a document. You actually a bunch of things to help you develop documentation and control them, an encryption process if you wanted to encrypt files, graphic subsystem that atrophied when we sort of lost any kind of support. If you got to meet the commercial world back in the late 70s, nobody was using graphics, so they weren't going to buy it, and the owner of us by then was saying, well, you know, if the users aren't going to pay for it, we're not going to invest in it. So the graphics atrophied, but you can still call up the system and look and say, oh, insert box, move rectangle, delete. So it's the same kind of command feeling. Mail subsystem, matchers, modify. You go into programming subsystems to load or compile, etc. Anyway, Untable subsystem was actually a primitive, by the mid-70s, a primitive spreadsheet, but again, there was no money to, once we got moved in the commercial world, no money to develop that further. So if we take a next step into G20, an advantage you get if you have this kind of grammar-driven command language interpreter is that you can extend its capability to be able to read command scripts and interpret them. And if you add to that it's got the control things like conditionals, if, and looping, and jumping, branching, that are quite simple textual statements that so people who aren't programmers can use the same thing, jump to something. They can actually write down the commands as they would actually see them and use them here, move around and do things. So some people built embarrassingly complex systems on top of that. I found one place where they built a whole accounting system using this thing, and they were so thrilled with themselves, and it took about an hour to go through and post a whole bunch of things out of their journal to 15 or 20 accounts, but they were totally thrilled with what they'd done. But the idea was that they can do that very flexibly, and as soon as they get some macro, if it's very complicated, it's very useful. You get an application programmer to come in and clean it up and something like that. But anyway, those are the provisions that we think are important. And then G21 was something also that we've been saying for many, many years is very critical, and it's being really pushed on more now. But we started employing the shared screen concept with a full screen working probably about 1972, the first time I remember doing it between Palo Alto and Rome, New York, which we both were looking at the same screen, and we could pass the controls back and forth and talking on the telephone and work. So we had it built into the architecture then by 75 or 76 in this way that you could, both of you go into the conference subsystem that had commands in it that helps you set this up. And you could say what user you wanted to, what host that user was on, etc. and then you both, which one's going to be the shower, which one's going to be the viewer, and then you both would say, all right, I'm ready, and you within a minute of each other, you click, and the things go together and reach out and connect and make this link up and down here. And the guy that's going to be doing the viewing, his stuff here gets put on standby, and the virtual terminal controller, it gets the same things that come or go out into here, so that the stuff that comes through to his terminal gets converted to whatever his terminal needs, comes down here and gets converted to his, so they don't even have to have the same kind of terminals like that. So this was just part of our standard environment for the field support to do coaching, or for administrative people to go look at what you're doing or monitoring stuff. And I've done it from Norway to New Jersey. The most dramatic was in Singapore, where I was giving a talk for the evening for maybe 150 people that were the government officials and university officials about all this, and projecting the screen, the color projector. This is six or 7 years ago. And I'd reached through the internet, the international networks, into internet and to my host, and was flying it there, and amazingly it worked very effectively. And then I call up Dwayne Stone, and pretty soon that screen clears and there's his. And he's doing something with a table subsystem. So his voice comes out on the speakerphone, he's explaining what he's doing, and then he passes me the controls and I work on it. And it was really quite stunning. And then to cap that off, I said, well, Dwayne, what time is it there? And he says, well, 8 o'clock. So it was 8 o'clock in the evening where we were. You mean it's 8 o'clock in the morning? Right. So it was 12 hours difference, which gives you a really interesting feeling. Well, where are you, Dwayne? Home, my basement. It was really a very dramatic sort of thing. But we've published, et cetera, that's an important thing to do for years. And for some reason, it's being treated as sort of a specialty adjunct that people provide as something to do. You can fit within different environments. But it really should be a standard thing in the whole networked environment, just like the procedure call protocols have to be. It's such a powerful, important thing to do. So he says, all right, so these are the command language interpreter kind of thing to give control of language, and the allowance of different looks and feel with that same vocabulary is one of the very important parts of it. And the other is to provide on the command scripts, and then the shared screen. So those are why I wanted to go through, just to come back and show you. And there's one picture in G22. Well, I talked to Pierluigi.
Yes, you said that this shared screen conferencing should be more widely available. I've seen and heard of dramatic demonstrations made, but can you give an idea of let's say, I mean, I work and I have colleagues in Taiwan, in Europe. What do I do? Like,
well, if there's some kind of budget issue that they've raised and they've got a plan like that, you can actually both see it on the screen and move through and work on it together while you're talking on the telephone. Or if there's a memorandum that you're trying to get straight, or if you're a supervisor and you're looking at his design or wander through source code, it's just like you've just got the same blackboard, and you're working on the thing that is of concern then in front of you. Or if you're a coach, somebody's in trouble, I don't know how to use this, don't know how to do this. Well, the coach can come online and say, well, give me the controls, I'll show you. Go through and do it, or talk them through it. Yeah, walk through design reviews. To get 20 people from around the world can be all walking through the same design.
Yeah, in the manufacturing world, where we've got similar process, extremely valuable, because everything we do is in some media, and this is critical. We're doing it with conference and that sort of thing.
Right.
It's one.
Well, you can ask the question is, why is it taken so long that, you know, Hewlett-Packard puts out a product that they call X-Share or something like that, Shared X. And Timbuktu for the Macintosh world and stuff like that. But so, you know, they've only fit in a special part of the world. But anyway, it's part of a paradigm thing that, you know, it's not recognized as something that's inevitable or necessary. And so you can see one of the publications back here in the 70s, we're talking about that. But you know, you wonder why it takes so long. That's another paradigm thing. And the user world is, you know, losing a tremendous amount of potential utility because it's not there yet. And it could have been being planned along with all of the other internet standards that have been evolving. See? So anyway, the assumption about the organization of the future, that those architectural principles seem very critical, and how are they going to get moved? So that's the kind of thing where one organization looks at and says, that's important, my God, that's the kind of thing where a C community reaching across between organizations, that you know, there are going to be lots of things like that emerging that are larger in scope than any one organization is going to be able to comfortably cope with. So that's a kind of thing the C community could really be valuable. You know, that's only one of the kind. I mean, that's an important one. And see, the other one, as we've said before, is if you're going to start exploring that frontier out there with different configurations of technologies and human system things, to start finding out where the really value is and how to focus and encourage, if not intimidate, the vendors to start giving them the things they need instead of the things that are going to sound good to the non-explorers. Anyway, so one of the things about looking at this kind of interface thing too that we might as well get on is in G25, you sort of said, if you wish, you look at all the different kinds of applications that you might be touching on when you sit down and work in your augmented knowledge workshop. And you said, well, if you went out across here and were looking at if all the functional things you could extract from these things were laid out along this axis here, and I was going to make a profile here of which of those functions was I going to employ to how high a degree for a given person, you could come down here and for a given person get his profile of the kind of usage that he nominally would be expected to be interested in employing. There'd be some kinds of places where heavy or light or spotty sort of thing. And he says, well, that's the manager. Then you come over to G27 and he says, well, you know, a skilled professional worker might have a much heavier profile. So this is the flexibility, they could say, that means that the professional users have a bigger vocabulary with probably more qualifiers on things and would want to be much more skilled in flying it. So they could just have a different, you know, extended vocabulary and better. But for both of them, what you want down here is they all seem to, whatever he extracts out there needs to feel like it's a coherent workshop vocabulary and practice that they can use. So that was sort of the kind of image that was driving some of this. Ted?
Doug, where does the idea of using this same functionality in terms of learning come in? For example, these are application would do as part of the work. At the same time, there's within each of them learning more about, but there might be just the having to bring yourself up to speed on content knowledge so that you could make decent use of this. How did you conceptualize that?
Well, those are just, if you're going to have computer functionality to help learn and explore, those are just other applications that you need a vocabulary and a way to control them.
So there would be other blocks added on to this?
Oh, absolutely, on, off, to the left. Oh, good grief. Yeah, sorry about that. Those are just picked at random. I don't even know what they all are anymore.
It's a canonical set, it's okay.
Boy, it's, you know, this is what dialogue is so important. You know, I haven't thought about that for years. That list is there. Probably be well to update that. All right, So anyway, when we start talking about the actual hyperdocument system that was in the back end, this is the framework. And let me show you how it's really employed. If you go to G22, how you'll be seeing it today when we work with it is that what we wrote as a program that will work in the PC that's sitting here that's supporting this display. There's a local program called augterm that then emulates the higher level virtual terminal that we had in the system. So the user interface system and the back end, etc., are in a DEC 20 over at SRI. And the link between the PC and the user interface system is over a modem at 2400 baud. So that's the way we'll be showing it. And we're also faced with a problem of trying to be compatible with the actual ways you guys can see it on display monitors that are TV. And so there's a card in that XT there. And incidentally, why are we using such old-fashioned as a XT? Well, it's because the interface that we've got for this thing is, it only works on an XT. And until I get enough money to move up, and Dave Gardner may have, his group may have made a solution that I'd rather work having this than on hell with the power. That really interesting, the flexibility. But anyway, so there's a card in this PC that generates VGA to drive this VGA, or you can go in and change a mode where it'll start outputting on a special port in the back of that card the NTSC kind of signal that's what your standard home video recorder and so that uses like that. So that's what we'll use to present this. And I'll start out by showing you what the display looks like at 80 character across screen like that, and you'll see that it's really not very readable. So I go back and change the mode to have 40 characters across, which means I got a much smaller thing to move around. And what I hope you can do is sort of extrapolate yourself to say, if I had a big window that was clear, it wouldn't look quite so crowded, but we could still show a lot. So much for all of that, and now we'll go ahead back to F. So what we talk about this as a hyperdocument system, and we're sort of implicitly saying, for us, it's a stage on the way to a someday open hyperdocument system. And that what I'll try to concentrate on showing you today are just those things that seem uniquely valuable to retain as we move into a more modern world and merge with lots of other things that are available in there. And try to describe the paradigm reorientation that suggested those difference in operating active principles. So in F2 we just a little bit of telling about this system that's called Augment. So we actually started getting support in 1963 from ARPA to build something, and by 1965 we were on our second machine and had mouse and key set working. And in 67 we shifted over to a time-sharing system, so we rebuilt it on an SDS 940. And then in 1969 and 70 we redid it again to move to a 10X machine. It was a PDP-10 with special hardware added to be flexible demand paging time-sharing. And then later the shift to a TOPS 20, DEC 20 was practically trivial because there was so much similarity between the operating systems. So anyway, there's all that kind of evolution. So it was like 5 machines moving across in a period of 8 years. And so each time we could improve the architecture. And then we redid the architecture several times in the early 70s, evolving to the point where we were showing you. Then in 1967, 1977 and 76 and 77, we ran into a real problem in the paradigm. That the paradigm that was emerging out in the research world just made our paradigm look orthogonal, and too bad. So we lost our research and support, and so it was going to dismantle our laboratory totally. But here's this beautiful big system that really was a workhorse, and we'd already started selling services over the network. So we persuaded them instead to auction it off and sell it to a commercial company. So Timeshare bought it as a way to get into office automation, shutter. And then in 1984, McDonnell Douglas, in trying to expand its world into being not totally absorbed in aerospace, but get some information systems world, acquired Timeshare and TimeNet with several other acquisitions to form something about $1 billion a year revenue in information services. And way down in the corner was our little tiny piece. And I'd been removed before then. I mean, when I got removed at SRI, there was so much distrust of this guy who must have been doing something wrong that I sort of said I spent most of my time in back offices rather than front, and couldn't talk to customers. So it was, and I was helping Timeshare with some organizational improvement issues that were very educational. Then when we became part of McDonnell Douglas, in all the turmoil, I could start spending a lot of time in the aerospace side. So first thing that caught their attention were these architectural principles, because they were really trying to look at how they integrate the architectures throughout the whole engineering and manufacturing world. So that got very interested, and then a few of them got interested in the hyperdocument part of it. And by then we were also supporting commercially some very interesting large organization things going. And the aerospace actually tried some pilot operations, and some of them could only be chalked up as miserable failures, but they taught us a lot. And there were a couple of them that were just glowing successes, but failed in another sense. You know, glowing successes that the participants said, God, this is the way we can manage big projects, let's go. But the very high level guide said, well, we've decided that we're only going to buy, not make any systems, and none of the vendors, if you find a vendor that can do this, good. And the answer was you couldn't even convince the vendor reps that this was real. They'd say, we already do that. Or we'll send you our guy that's designing the system we're going to come out with next year, and he'll show you. And there was just no correlation. So it's very sad, very educational, very paradigm and stretching. Like that. So then the system just died about 3 years ago, that the maintenance and the support service couldn't keep up with the low cost of other forms of getting service, even though it's selling like that. So then when we started the Bootstrap Institute, we were saying, well, it'd be important to show this as a model, etc. So we got a chance to set up on a Stanford machine, and then they junked all their Deck 20s last July, and you could have one for $1.50 if you want it, but if you get a maintenance contract from DEC, it costs you the order of $50,000 a year just to maintain it. You know, and it isn't as powerful as probably an Apple PowerBook or whatever it has like that. It's got a beautifully flexible multitasking time-sharing system and a lot of very nice aspects. And there are these 150 or so man-years of Augment software sitting in there. So anyway, we had no access to Augment since the end of June until about a week ago. And so George Touchton, who was here yesterday, gave us a bit of money to get up firing, sort of demonstrate to see sort of the utility potential of that kind of principle in the world he wants to build. So very fortunate we got it back up. So anyway, so it's also a little hard to run it because in the 9 months since then, I've been having to learn a bunch of other things, and I get back in, and there's such a wealthy world out there like that, and I hadn't realized how much I operated with just the visual map in my head of how this terrain was laid out. So if I stumble and you say, aha, see, this is a systems of failure because he couldn't find his way around it, well, I would I would make my roadmaps much differently if I was going to work on it so seldom. Things like that. Anyway, so what you have to have is some tolerance and look at it as say, okay, there are principles in here.
So this is running on Deck 20.
Yeah. I want, you can almost ask, are the people in here who've never heard of a Deck 20? And you probably find that it first appeared in the early 70s, and its design is based in the late 60s. And, yeah.
Can you just say one brief thing about the two paradigm conflicts? It sounds like
You mentioned one conflict in the research community, which was a paradigm blockage, which cost the whole thing. You mentioned what I thought was another paradigm in industry, which is also to namely specify specific functional pieces by certain vendors who want to control that particular aspect of the market.
Wasn't quite like that, but well, the first one is that people just felt like, hey, this office, executive information systems, office automation were the hot things, and they were just starting out and had no idea the kind of architectural requirements that were going to be in the whole organization. So they'd look at our architecture and say, oh my God, and they looked at our large vocabulary command languages, and they looked at the funny way it was, and there wasn't any way we could tell them that we've got this user interface system that you can put on your look and feel, so this is the high value pursuit. And they just didn't, these things just didn't see it, and it's very, very educational. The other one out there was that two kinds of things. One is that if a higher up was finally dinged with the budget by the people there were all excited, they'd been using this for some years and wanted to use more of it, and you look at that and he didn't have time to experience or to see what it was, and they'd say, oh, it's really this great stuff, and there's this linkage and structure and viewing, and it's got all these things in it. And the guy said, well, so what? It's sort of like, and he turned to his MIS guy and says, what do you think? And the guy'd say, I've never heard of that, but you got to believe that if it were any good, DEC or IBM or Hewlett-Packard would be doing it, so I wouldn't risk it. And they only have about that much time to decide, and there goes the decision. And the other one is we spent over a year on a pilot operation that the corporate vice president for information systems said, you guys need a pony to ride now. If you get the guys in that program that really like it, I can probably do something for you. So 14, 15 months later, we come back to him and says, well, they're excited and raring to go. And he wouldn't even talk to us because he decided then that he's not going to fool around with any more investment in anything but buying stuff. So that was the word, and it just dropped. So very, very disappointed project people. Maybe if we can get to show you a little bit about the project management world that they could see from their world. If I stop, if you guys listen faster. So anyway, we're going to talk about requirements for every document system, and then towards an open one and issues. So we're going to be doing most of our discussion and demonstrating with the first part of it here. And as an F4, that we just say that the Kodiak, which hasn't been very thoroughly transmitted to you, I understand, but the hypothesis is that the way to get the first real advance in that is to go for a hyper-document system, even if the rest of the architecture isn't ideal. But that's the big learning environment to move into, and even if you don't have global architectures that can support that, the localized deployment of that in the C community and some of the other applications puts you way ahead in learning and value from it. So then we start saying, what are you going to do about giving this shared, concurrent development, integration, and application? Well, a very first stage, obviously, is saying, let's share the files. So, this is something, for instance, Lotus Notes is the core of it. We share files in a wide area kind of thing. But remember I was telling you in the augmentation system how the picture was saying, hey, there ought to be a new dimension a number of new dimensions in the human system, and one of it can start with language and how you externalize it, that you get structure and viewing and all kinds of hyper stuff in there. So let's start with that. So we never did build any vanilla flavored files to share. That by 66 or 7 we were full tilt on the structure and hyperlinks. And the kind of paradigm shift you see in 6 is just depicted of saying at the various stages of evolution of the way we externalize symbols in our heads, each one made quite a difference and impact in the world. And what people coming up through the hard copy documents and this picture of going to word processor and producing hard copy is something that isn't really in line with the evolution. Just showing it that. You know, the real thing is where you move to that you're looking through that window of the workstation at the knowledge that instead of on very stiff two-dimensional sheet of paper, it's this multidimensional, multimedia, dynamic, very highly mobile environment that you're going to be in, and that almost everything you're going to want to do, you'll be able to do much more efficiently there, including all kinds of reaching to other people and dynamics with that. And so it'll become the environment. So that's the paradigm shift to there. And unfortunately, there's so much the rest of the world has gotten caught up in the drooping off with word processing and WYSIWYG. That's the purpose of the computer, is to help you make documents or see on a screen what, you know, what God-made documents are supposed to look like. See, so really, it's a definite paradigm shift, and it's going to be a trouble for everybody to sort of make that shift. So anyway, so we go through that, and so the next visuals are just talking about that, and kind of thinking like if you're visiting a strange city, strange place, you can get by with grunts and gestures, but if you're going to live there, you want powerful language. So he says, all right, shared files, we start looking at this model that we see in the next page, in F9. We're going to fill all those horizontal slots in sort of stages with the kind of a picture of what this design of the system should be. So this is essentially the model we started with way back, and it extended more to be systematized later. But so we've already talked about the open-ended vocabulary sort of thing. That grammar there was built so that your vocabulary is open-ended as well as flexible and can be controlled. So he says there's no telling a priori how large a vocabulary you're going to want to develop and be using. And so if you really said, I'm going to have an open-ended one, and if people really believed it, they would have different options for users from the menu or command character codes, because those run out of gas as the vocabulary grows. If you were going to compose a memo and the only way you had it is by selecting your words off a menu, you know, you'd say, hey, this is nonsense. This may be okay for somebody who's doing pidgin English and can't write, but this is nonsense. So in a sense that it seemed to me inevitable that that kind of interface is going to run out of gas eventually. And that's okay if there is an option that doesn't cause a lot of redesign of your head, stuff like that. This is all right. So then we move on to the next box in F11, and says one of the options we want to have is for high performance control. And so just as the example, this is what we went through yesterday using the key set and all. So we've already sort of gone through the next set of slides enough. And if you want to, we can look at F13 a minute to just sort of say, this is the sort of start of the way the alphabet goes. And 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 ways on your fingers can teach you that very rapidly. And you remember that I could, if when I'm entering characters, if I hold down some of the other buttons on the mouse, tells to shift the case. So I can, this is by itself is a lowercase a. If I hold this down, it's an uppercase A. If I hold this down, it's an exclamation mark, or a 0, or 1, or 2, stuff like that. So the alphabet's very easy to learn, and that way when you're giving commands, if it's a character-driven command environment, to select very easy. So then the thing I was trying to show you yesterday in F14 as a way of sort of exemplifying that your eye may be down the sort of bottom right where the star is, and it's where your cursor is, etc. Then your eye up on top happens to see that I need to replace that A with an E. See? And so here's what you're doing. You start moving the cursor up there, and on the way, your left hand hits an R to C that says, I want to replace a character, and you click on it and hit an E, and click again, and it's done. See? So it's on the way, it's telling you what to do. And that business of doing the two in parallel saves you a great deal of time, and the business of specifying what class of object, a character, a word, a phrase, a visible, an invisible, a statement, a branch, and all that, on the way, or a graphic object or something like that, means that it's so much easier to get the maximum target possible, so it makes it a lot easier to click on it. So those things make it very flexible. And so the evolution through 15 and 16, kind of the model of how you're holding a lot of concepts in your head, and in 16, yes, those concepts are symbolized a lot. And he says, yeah. So in 17, we say, well, look, there's something new that we actually think of what we're putting in the computer as an external map of the concept structure in our head. And it can be a much more realistic map as far as representing the structural relationship you have and the modularity of the concepts you hold. Much better map of that than paper is conventionally used. So that was the driving force to say, okay, let's do that. Let's build a structure in there that can represent that, and then facilitate with a computer your ability to output it into that structure and rearrange the structure and all of that to mean what you want it to. And then also let the computer help you when you're studying it to look at all kinds of views of that. Because it may be that you don't want to be bothered with actually showing explicitly some of those structural relationships. And also, hey, while you're at it, think of a lot of other optional views that you want to help. So first thing, though, is getting content and structure in. So that's in F18. And that moved to F19. So the arrow out of this little bump on the right says, yeah.
Just a typo. Emergence of outline processing, notes there on F18 mean online processing. So, I mean outline processing in reality.
Oh, on the right. I see. Well, no. He said it reads on the text on the right of F19, emergence of integrated multimedia electronic documents. No, above it. Oh, excuse me.
That's used to represent explicit symbol structures?
Sure. In here, one of the views is essentially like an outline, but it's the whole document. And some of the optional views make it look just like an outline. And then you can go back to the whole thing if you want to. So as far as we know, yes, that was the first outline processing. And we never understand why later you'd have a separate thing to outline and another thing to make your documents. If they're integrated, it really is much more powerful. You know, I didn't even see that.
Is that a capability that this has, or you're saying that?
Yeah, that was built in, and all this stuff was running by 1968. That's what, if we have time, we show you some clips tomorrow of it running.
And what is the input data?
Just like a word processor, whatever you ingest and structure or type in.
But the progression from 15, 16, 17 to 18 sounds like from gibberish you get...
No. That isn't what I mean. It's like, you know, F16 says, look, when you have some well-formed concepts in your mind and you want to externalize them into some external medium, so what are your options? So if you say, oh, I've got paper, then I have to make a map onto paper, which really doesn't represent all of the structural relationships, etc., in your mind. So then the issue was, what if I can put it into some medium that I can make a much more accurate representational map? So that's like when you use your word processor, you make a map. That's not, you don't call that gibberish or gibberish. Maybe you do, but no, so I don't know where the gibberish implication came into your mind.
How does the program know what the relationships are that you yourself didn't recognize?
Oh, no way did I say you didn't recognize it. I said you can get help. That doesn't mean it's going to be magic, but that just means that I'll show you. It'll come out. It isn't anything mystical. If you want to move a paragraph on a page in your word processor, that's a little modest way of restructuring it. So how does a computer know you want to do that? You give it a series of commands. You want to move a glob to some new location.
Doug, it seems...
Oh. Yeah, we're on overtime. Sorry, but go ahead with your question.
I've had a thought while listening to you on this, getting away from the paradigm and the implications of that, and it seems that one possibility of what you're implying is that we've been limited in expressing what goes on in our minds conceptually by the very fact of using paper in the printed word. Get away from that, perhaps our ability to express and collaborate would be much improved, but getting from one to the other is quite difficult.
Yeah, but it's, what was the transition from a stone tablet to papyrus, or papyrus to paper and printing? They're all difficult, but it's just inevitable. So what we did was say, let's go explore that new terrain and learn the value. And boy, the value was, people didn't have to live very long in it after they'd learned how to get around in it before. They still tell me, no matter where they're working on, what kinds of high-power machines, that they've never had a system that was as flexible fit. And even the programmers say there isn't any other thing yet to match it in their experience as far as developing and managing software, which is so you guys sat around longer than you were supposed to. But if you don't mind coming back at 10:30, I'd like to get going. So, okay?